We went to stay at my grandparents' house. I really loved it there. There was the sea, my friends, and the weather was beautiful. But the only thing I didn't like was my grandparents' house. It was amazing during the day, but once evening came, all the lights disappeared, and it became a very deserted place. Plus, it was far from the city center. One day, my grandparents went to hunt pigs in the evening, and I was left alone at home. At first, everything was great. I was watching TV, snacking on something, and planning to go swimming in the sea the next day. While engrossed in the television show, I heard a faint sound of wind chimes coming from downstairs. You know, those delicate chimes that tinkle when the wind blows and make things sway. The peculiar thing was that our doors were always closed to prevent flies, mice, or cats from entering, and the doorbell only rang when the door was opened. At first, I didn't pay much attention, assuming it was just the wind playing tricks on my ears, but when it happened repeatedly, I grew curious and decided to investigate. With each passing chime, my curiosity intensified. As I descended the staircase, the sound grew louder, echoing through the empty house. I reached the ground floor, and to my astonishment, the front door was wide open. My heart skipped a beat, and a sense of unease crept over me. I peered outside, and there stood my grandfather, quietly tying a fishing line to the porch railing. Relief washed over me as I realized it was just my grandfather, but I couldn't help feeling puzzled by the strange occurrence. I approached him cautiously and asked, "Have you returned?" My grandfather, a man of few words, simply nodded his head without saying a single word. It was unusual, but I dismissed it, assuming he was preoccupied with his task. Not wanting to linger downstairs, I made my way back up to my room. Just as I reached the top of the stairs, the phone rang, and I quickly answered it. It was my father, his voice tinged with concern. He asked if I was okay, and I reassured him, "I'm fine. Grandfather is downstairs." There was a momentary pause on the other end of the line before my father spoke again, his voice filled with surprise. "Son, we'll be home a bit late. Go to your room and don't go outside. There are pigs around." Confusion washed over me as I relayed my father's message to my grandfather, who had just entered the house. My father's urgent tone broke through the phone speaker. "Get out of there. Go to your room and turn on the lights. That's not your grandfather." My heart raced and a cold shiver ran down my spine. I turned to face my grandfather, only to see his hands trembling unnaturally, his feet twisted backwards. The realization struck me like a bolt of lightning. The man before me was not my grandfather. Panic gripped me and I sprinted towards my parents' room, desperate to find safety. Locking myself on the balcony, I peered through the glass, realizing that my phone was still downstairs, out of reach. Fear coursed through my veins as I contemplated how to reach my parents for help. I shouted and whistled, hoping they would hear me across the vast valley that separated us. Suddenly, my imposter grandfather appeared at the window of the balcony, his eyes gleaming with madness as he began to laugh maniacally. Trembling, I recited every prayer I knew, hoping for some divine intervention. Astonishingly, my grandfather turned around abruptly and left, disappearing into the darkness. Relieved for a moment, I let out a sigh of relief. However, my respite was short-lived. As I tried to calm myself down, the sound of cracking firewood reached my ears, originating from downstairs. I peered down from the balcony, and to my horror, I saw my imposter grandfather returning, accompanied by a large, menacing black dog. They were shouting something in a language I couldn't comprehend, their voices filled with a malevolence that sent chills down my spine. With growing terror, I realized that I was trapped on the balcony. Panic surged through me as I watched them ascending towards me, their pace determined and relentless. My imposter grandfather's eyes were completely white, devoid of any humanity, and his intentions were clearly malicious. He unleashed the dog and it snarled, baring its sharp teeth, ready to attack. In a desperate attempt to defend myself, I grabbed anything within reach, a nearby broomstick, and wielded it as a makeshift weapon. Adrenaline surged through my veins as I swung the broomstick in an attempt to keep the dog at bay. The creature lunged at me, its jaws snapping inches away from my trembling body. But then, everything went black. The details became hazy, and my memory faltered. The next thing I knew, I woke up in the living room surrounded by my parents. Confusion and disorientation flooded my mind as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. The events of the previous night felt like a fevered dream, yet the fear and trauma were all too real. Tears welled up in my eyes, and I mustered the courage to ask about my grandfather's whereabouts. My mother's expression turned solemn, her voice tinged with sorrow. She revealed that my grandfather hadn't returned from the pig hunt that evening. My heart sank, and a wave of grief washed over me as the truth settled in. The man I encountered was not my grandfather. He was something sinister, an imposter with nefarious intentions. In the days that followed, the incident weighed heavily on my family. News soon reached us that my real grandfather had been found, his body bearing the brutal marks of a savage pig attack. The details were gruesome, and it was clear that his death had been agonizing. The tragedy shook our family to its core, and the memory of that fateful night haunted our dreams. Unable to bear the weight of the memories and the sinister presence that seemed to loom over the house, my grandmother made the decision to leave. She moved out of that house, leaving behind the eerie darkness and the horrors that had unfolded within its walls.